Hi, I'm Laila Hobbs, the co-founder of Social Launch Labs. You're listening to a special edition of the Marketing News Canada podcast, recorded live on site at SocialWest, Caglary 2025 at the TELUS Convention Center. In this episode, we bring you a conversation captured during the conference with Dave Thomas, the Director of Strategy at Everbrave, where we discuss his Strategy of Everything framework and the importance of strategic thinking for marketers and business owners. Thanks for listening to Marketing News Canada. For more episodes and other great stories from Canadian marketers, visit marketingnewscanada.com. Thanks to our producers at Social Next Events and editors at Social Launch Labs. A special thank you to Dave Thomas for sharing his insights on strategic thinking and the Strategy of Everything framework. You can learn more about his work and download free tools at thestrategyofeverything.com or connect with him on LinkedIn. He also has a podcast where he interviews people from various fields about their strategies. Thank you so much for watching. Hi, Dave. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Dave, you are the Director of Strategy at Everbrave.
That's correct.
What is it that you do and how did you get into that?
Yeah, so I am the Strategy Director at Everbrave. We're a growth marketing agency here in Calgary. So we have three kind of main pillars. One is growth strategy and marketing. One is branding. And the third is HubSpot. So we're a certified platinum HubSpot partner as well. So we do like those three things, mix them all together and help people grow their businesses.
Very cool. Today we're going to be talking about the strategic thinking aspect though.
Yep.
And that is something that you're actually speaking about today at SocialWest.
Yes, correct.
So you are talking about the Strategy of Everything. So this is what would you call this, a framework?
Yeah, it's a set of tools and frameworks and methodologies that I've put together over the last kind of year and a half to really kind of help people simplify strategy by up-leveling their strategic thinking skills.
Before we jump into that, I just want to backpedal here and talk about strategic thinking for marketers. So you've obviously spent some time really thinking about the skills that marketers would have, and this has kind of landed front and center. Can you talk about what strategic thinking means for you and why you think it's so important for marketers to use it? For
sure. So I think, when people are trying to get experience in marketing, there's always this, they want to do strategy, they want to like do the bigger things and stuff like that. And we always have these conversations with marketers. And I think people always kind of lean on this excuse of, oh, it's experience. You have to have a lot of experience to be able to do these strategies because then you've seen things and you do stuff. And so I've really been thinking about like, well, how can we accelerate that? How can we accelerate like this experience for people? And that's when I started to think about like, what are these 4 strategic thinking skills? So
Before we jump into that, why did you want to even accelerate this like learning
it's mostly
curve?
To help like coach marketers up, right? And get them to build the skills that they need to do more strategic
why
thinking.
was that important to you? You've got a good job. You're doing your thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, it's like working with the junior people at our agency. It's helping people up-level the work that they're going to do for clients ultimately. But also I think like in this day of technology and AI, I think the human thinking skills are even more important than ever. And so the more people are relying on these technologies, actually the more obvious it is if you don't have some of these skills. And so I think when you look at leveraging those kinds of tools, it's becoming a crutch and you start to see like the inaccuracies come out. And if you're not able to be an expert on what it's spitting out, you really don't know the quality of it, right? So the example I use all the time is if you ask ChatGPT to make you a map of Europe, right? If you don't know what the map of Europe looks like, it's going to spit something out that's close and you'll be like, okay, cool. Like that must be Europe. But maybe Poland's a little bit off. Maybe Italy's a little bit skewed. But if you don't know what it actually looks like,
then you just don't know.
You're just kind of screwed. Yeah. Right. So if you don't have those strategic thinking skills, if you can't be an expert in what you're doing, the tools can definitely lead you astray.
That is so interesting. Thank you. I appreciate you answering that question. So we're a young company and we're hiring, a lot of summer interns who are working with us. And I agree that, these tools, while they are so beneficial, they absolutely can lead people astray. And it comes back to like, this is such a strange analogy, but I remember when I was in high school math and I was doing calculus, my professor was always like, you need to know why the calculus works. You cannot just use the formulas or in physics, you cannot just use the formulas and plug in everything. Right. Like you need to know the methodology behind it because when you get a weird answer, you need to know why. Or you at least need to know, hey, that's probably not
Yeah, this
right.
seems wrong. There's something, yeah.
There's something wrong. Like you have to have a level of intuition towards the work that you're doing. So moving back to that, the strategy of everything, there's 4 main components of this strategic thinking model.
Yeah.
You want to dive into them?
Yeah, for sure. So this all kind of started because one of the junior people asked me, like, how do you just come up with a strategy kind of on the spot? And my answer was like, I don't know, experience. Like, again, this is a really kind of like shitty answer. And so I spent some time really thinking about like, well, what is happening in my brain? Like, what am I doing when I'm thinking these things through, where I'm on a call with somebody learning about their business, and by the end of it, I kind of know what they should do. And so I started to kind of unpack that, and that's where the 4 kind of tools and skills came from. So the first one is really getting clear on what your goal is. Like, what is your ultimate goal? And then aligning all of your tasks down to the day-to-day level so that they're all in service of it. And so what happens a lot of the time is, people who are executing work get distracted or are working on the wrong thing, and that doesn't ladder up to the ultimate goal of the company. Or, if you don't have a framework, if you don't have some kind of way to push back on distraction requests, which happens all the time. Your boss comes in on Monday and says, oh, I listened to a podcast, I think we should do this. And all of a sudden everybody goes left and starts working on that, and they lose track of the actual goal. Get to the end of the quarter and everybody's like, oh, we didn't hit our numbers. Well, you told us to go. Those things happen all the time. So you need that structure and that framework so that the people who are creating the strategy and leading the company know that the work that's happening is aligned, and the people who are working know the work I'm doing is important and it's impacting the company, and I'm doing it for this reason, so they don't get distracted. So that's the first one. The second one is understanding the rules and the constraints. And so, if you're trying to learn a new sport or you're watching something new, first thing you need to do is figure out, like, what are the rules? Like, why are we doing these things, or what's happening? And so people don't generally stop and think about that explicitly around what they're doing. So take your company and look at, what constraints are we under? Which ones are really flexible? Which ones are going to have a big impact? Which ones can we maybe work around? Which ones are we imposing on ourselves because of our values or our beliefs or the company we're trying to be? And mapping all of that out. So you map that all out, and then you talk about the other players. Who else is playing the game? Who can help you? Who's working against you? Who's setting these rules? And then you can map them all together and really start to understand which ones should we put our time and effort on, because, like, you're running a small company with only a couple people, you can't waste time.
Time is a constraint that is always,
so you need to pick, right, which ones. So that's the second one. The third one is risks and opportunities. So being able to identify risks and opportunities, and again, prioritize them. Mm-hmm. And I kind of created 3 different types of risks and opportunities. So there's the known risks. So if we sat down and we're like, what risks do you have, like, right now? You'd list off 5, right? The second one is the hidden risks. So if you dig a little bit deeper and ask some more like probing questions, you'd be like, oh, actually, we didn't see that coming, and that would kind of screw us up. And then the third one is wildcard risks. So if you think about a wildcard risk, could be like, what if a tornado flew through here right now? We wouldn't know. You can't possibly prepare for it, but sometimes you can kind of have a ballpark idea. So you then take those risks and opportunities and you map them according to how likely you think they're to happen versus the impact it would have on your mission. And so then you start to see, like, oh, this is very likely to happen and it is going to screw us up. So therefore, that's probably the most important one, right? Or this opportunity could have a huge impact on us, and we think we can pull this one off now based off of this map. Oh, and all these other ones are distractions. It's not that probably won't happen, or if it does, it's not that big a deal. And so it helps you focus them. And the fourth is your unfair advantage. So leveraging your unfair advantage, which is what I'm like talking about today. And so what that is really about is doing a little bit of reflection for either yourself, then your team, then your company, about like what makes you special. And so I think people know generally, like people always say, like, play to your strengths, right? Like, oh, play to your strengths, go with your gut, blah, 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 blah. But if you get explicit about it, you can then recognize and apply those opportunities, those advantages in the right area. So then you can figure out, so the tool helps you map out like what you're strong at, mm-hmm. what you're weak at, what your like unique experiences are. So stuff you maybe have done that others haven't. And then what your values are. And so when you get explicit...
Sorry, let me just jump in here for a quick
Yeah,
second.
go ahead.
So is this unfair advantage, this mapping, is this on the individual or the organization?
It's both.
Okay.
It's both. So you would do this first map and understand, okay, maybe I've got this experience. You've clearly got some experience with video production. Maybe you went to like an RTV program somewhere and were like, oh, I could like make a business out of this. Some people don't have that advantage and they wouldn't apply it in a way. So if you can recognize and then apply your advantages, you'll figure out which ones of those risks and opportunities and constraints you actually have the best chance of winning at. And so you can do that as an individual. You can do it as, for yourself. And then, if you and everybody else on your team does it, you put them all together and you go, okay, combined. Okay, this is great. Well, you're an editor and I own a camera and I am comfortable talking in front of the camera. So we have everything we need to build this company.
Boom, YouTube channel.
Right, exactly. So that's kind of the combined team version, is kind of the sum of the parts. And then the last one is company. So you can look at your company and say, what are our strengths, weaknesses? What are our unique experiences as a group? And what are, our values as a company? And then you can do that for your competitors. And so you have all of these kind of, it's called the advantage mirror that you use to like reflect on these things. And then you can see like, oh, well, we're really strong here and they're weak there. They do this, but we could do that. Oh, so now you can start to spot like, where should we differentiate ourselves? Where should we set ourselves apart? Where can we actually win? And then conversely, you could see like, oh, well, they're actually really big and strong there and they could crush us if they did this. So we need to think about defense maybe, right, in that spot. So it's like those three different areas are how you can apply it.
Okay. Let's talk about execution. So that was very high level, and thank you for explaining, the strategy of everything. I also love the name, by the way, very encompassing. But let's talk into how do you actually apply this? So the first one is setting goals and aligning tasks. How do you actually go about, working with the team? Sit down. Are these team meetings? Do you have, project boards?
So there's like
what
a
do you
set
do?
of workshops, and I've created these tools. So for that one, we use this framework called the hierarchy of goals, and it's just a structure that walks you through your very top goal, and then every layer down goes, okay, how do we do that? So if we want to sell this podcast company for $1 million, what has to happen? We have to have this many customers. We have to have this much revenue. Okay, those are those things. Now, how are we going to get that much revenue? How are we going to get that many customers? And it continues to go down until you get to day-to-day tasks that are now like, okay, we know we need to go build a YouTube channel and create, a bunch of content. We need to work on our brand, all those things that you need to go actually do hands-on keyboards. But the work you're doing there is in service of this goal, which is in service of that goal. So you sit down and map that out. And then I help facilitate with people and work them through that. But you can do it on your own too if you know the tool. So that's the first one.
One of the things that I find really interesting being a small business owner is sometimes the goal that you are working towards is not actually the goal that will get you where you want. How do you make sure that when you're planning, because it seems like that big goal is the most important because it trickles down into everything else. How do you know that you've picked the right big goal?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So the right goal is really going to be aligned to what your final outcome is. This is where sometimes I work with business owners. I have to push them to say like, and they say, oh, we want to build a global brand and blah, blah, blah. But why? What's your actual goal? Like peel back the curtain a little bit. Do you want to sell this thing? Do you want to run this forever? Do you want to make it public? Let's be real. Like we're all in business to make money. And so
but money does different things for different people, right?
For sure.
A lifestyle business is very, very different than a business that's purely chasing as big as they can get, as much revenue they can get. Actually, when I was working with my business coach, he asked me that. He's like, do you want to be the biggest in the industry or do you want to be the best in your industry?
Yeah. And
I thought that was a very defining question for us as a company to really sit down there and say, what is the goal?
Right.
And for us, we reflected and was like, at the end of the day, this is a lifestyle business. Like we want to be a successful business.
Support ourselves.
But we want to have the time and the freedom to do things like travel.
Right.
And if it takes a little bit longer to, reach a revenue goal because we're traveling, it takes us an extra year or two and our growth is a little bit slower. That was okay for us.
Yeah, exactly. And so getting to that why you're doing it is the most important part of that very top of the hierarchy, right? And so that would be very different from someone who's like, I want to sell this podcast business to this other company for this much money. And so then you can start to say, okay, well, if I'm trying to do this, I'm just going pure revenue. Like here are the things that I would do and my plan would change, right? And if you're going for a lifestyle business, it's like, okay, maybe speed's not the most important thing. I don't really care. I just need enough clients to kind of, build the company. And if you look at it as the top goal, the most important goal has to be crystal clear. Because you as the leader of the company, if you don't know what that is, how does anybody else know? How do they know? How do they know what they're working on matters, or what they're actually going to be able to accomplish is getting towards that goal if you don't know what the goal is?
It's like everybody's driving around looking for the same spot, or they all think they're looking for the same spot. Nobody has a GPS and no one knows the name of the restaurant that you're trying to get to.
You're just chasing some vague, kind of vision statement or something. And so I think nailing that piece is the most important, because if you don't,
the whole rest of the system,
everything breaks. So the analogy I use is like, if your goal is to fly a plane from New York to Florida and you're off by a couple degrees, you end up in the ocean, right? So if your vision and if your goals and everything else that your company is doing are not perfectly aligned, you're going to end up in the ocean too. You're not going to have the lifestyle business. You're not going to have the revenue that you need, and you just get stuck in this kind of perpetual cycle until you figure it out.
I remember when I was younger, my dad used to say, if you shoot for the moon, you'll land among the stars. That is not necessarily true in the case of business.
Not all the time, no.
Moving on to the second part of setting goals, it's aligning tasks to goals.
Yeah.
What does that look like? Like in actual practical action, how do you ensure that your day-to-day tasks, are meeting a 10-year goal?
Yeah, so that's where the hierarchy of goals helps with like the different layers as you get down. So you kind of go from what is your vision, and then your mission is how you're going to get there. And then you have these strategic goals of like, we have to do these 4 things to do this. Okay, to do those 4 things, we're getting closer to tasks. Okay, those 4 things, now what are our kind of quarterly goals to know that we're getting there, and then how are we going to execute those? And so the very bottom layer becomes very tactical. And so that's the part that can change. It's a lot more flexible. You're at the bottom, right? And so those are the things where you start to test and start to just, figure out which ones are the highest priority. But the bottom of that kind of pyramid, as it kind of comes out, turns into basically a task, is all like, go do stuff. Here's the stuff we have to go do today, tomorrow, next week, in the next 3 months to hit that goal that's right above us, right? Which are those.
And how do you, like, over time, how do you ensure that the system stays cohesive and stays moving together? Because this, from what it sounds like, it's a very important, first step, but it's a really heavy mental load to sit down and plan out this whole entire hierarchy. I can imagine it can get off track if you're not reflecting on that regularly.
For sure.
What kind of reflection does your team use?
Yeah, so we look at things in kind of small chunks, and then they get bigger. So on a weekly basis, it's like, are the tasks getting done? Are we actually doing the things that we said we were going to do? Yes or no? When you're looking at a monthly situation, you're looking at, are they having an impact, right? And then on a quarterly reflection, we're looking at, are we actually making significant contribution to the goal, the massive goal? And so sometimes you get to that point, you're like, no, wait, we're kind of off track here. Why? Okay, were these the wrong tasks? Were these the wrong goals? Were these did we just not execute it properly? And that's why those different layers of reflection, like on the weekly, monthly, quarterly kind of.
And do you do this individually, or do you do this in a team capacity?
As a team.
Team capacity.
As a team, yeah. So it's your individual tasks are your individual tasks, right? Did you get your work done this week? Why or why not? And then, as a team, we look at, weekly numbers and things like that, that are kind of the indicators of like, are we on the right track? Are these things working? Are these the right strategies? So we do this with our clients too. Like our clients, we have to get really narrowly focused on like, what are the goals we've set for the client that we're responsible for? And there's a lot of other stuff around their company, but maybe we're just doing this one thing for them. Do we have the right number? And are we actually hitting those kind of goals weekly and monthly?
This sounds more like an operations than a marketing thing.
It's a lot of both. I mean, those very often overlap, right?
And I think that's true. I think, marketing is not an independent, it's not protected from the rest of the business. It has to integrate into the rest of the business.
Especially small businesses.
Business. I think sometimes we forget that as marketers, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. It's and that's the kind of environment that I work in the most. I spent a lot of time at startups and things like that, where it's like you're wearing multiple hats, right? I've worked at one place in my career where it's like, okay, these people do this and those people do that. And we're talking like they have like thousands of global marketers, just marketers. So it's like you're very specialized and all you do is that thing. But most people have to do multiple tasks, multiple things, wear multiple hats. So.
Okay. Next up is understanding constraints
and
rules.
Yeah.
That I feel like is fairly self-explanatory, but let's
dive into it. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. Like these aren't, changing the world. Like, oh my God, this guy's thought of like these things that nobody's ever thought of. Like there's through some of the research I've done, like there's cognitive brain function that like does this, and naturally this is how people kind of behave. But
well, then let me ask you this question. Why does understanding constraints and rules come after setting goals? Shouldn't you understand the constraints and the rules before you set the goal?
So it's kind of modular as well. So you can do it in order. You can do it sequentially. If you're like, hey, we got a project. What is the project? What's the goal of the project? You're always going to have that goal first. You're never going to be like, oh, we're on to, unless you're, the next way to use it is like, oh, we come up with these constraints, right? And then we find a constraint that we need to figure out. Now, what's our goal for that? And then we can re-loop through kind of the process. So you can either do this in a sequence, or you can use any one of the tools for a specific project at any time. So the constraints are important because you need to understand what you might be up against, right? Which constraints are put onto you, as far as like what are rules and laws and things like that you have to abide by that may not be flexible at all. Which ones are just resources, right? Everyone's under resource constraint of some kind, whether it's time, money, whatever. And then there's going to be those like moral or ethical constraints that you put on yourself. You're like, we're not going to hire jerks no matter how good they are. We are not going to rip off our customers, whatever. You could do those things, but you've decided you're not going to, right? And so understanding what they all are and which ones have the biggest impact and which ones you should focus on is and which ones you can't change. If you can't change it, like do your best to work around it, but then, figure out the ones that you actually could kind of work through.
The next step of that, after you understand your constraints and rules, is understanding your risks and your opportunities.
Yeah.
I'm curious as why you segmented this, because from my understanding, if you're setting your goals and you're understanding your tasks, you're going to see what the opportunities are. And then if you're understanding your constraints, you're going to see what the risks are. Why is this a completely separate step of this framework? Yeah,
good question. So you may have an idea of what those are. The goal of the strategy of everything overall is to make everything as simple and clear as possible. So strategy, if it's explicit and clear, is much easier to communicate, to get people on board with, and to execute. And so breaking them out into their own things, and sometimes you just need to do that for a project. You just need to look at this. We've got 2 ideas. Okay, cool. Let's do a risk and opportunity board and see what might happen if we do this, for scenario planning, for example. And so when you're doing it that way, it sits outside. And this is actually kind of like it's the fun part, where like sometimes you're brainstorming and things like that. And that's where you come up with these ideas. But then it's like, okay, well, which one should we do? Where do we prioritize it? And so when you look at risks and opportunities, very often, if we sat down right now and we started to brainstorm, ideas to market your podcast company, we'd probably the first round come up with like the same things. And most people just, okay, cool, let's go do those things, right? But if you sit down and take it a click deeper and you start looking at like, what are some of the hidden risks, you start to come up with new ideas. So there's this one facilitation technique that I use sometimes that I learned when I was at Intuit. and you make the team like do this big brainstorm, like come up with ideas how we're going to solve this thing or whatever. And then you make them rip it all up and start again. And now you can't use any of the ideas you just had. You have to come up with new ideas, and people have to push. And then all of a sudden you're thinking of things that you wouldn't have thought of before, because what happens is like those groups, they all come up with the same thing. And so getting explicit about the risks and the opportunities, sometimes you push yourself beyond what you just, when you're making a hierarchy of goals and you're just thinking about goals and tasks, like, oh, we should do this. Okay, great. But what if we really sit down and think about it? You come up with a whole nother layer.
A whole different set. It's interesting because it seems that, bringing this back to the beginning of the conversation, I feel like we all do this to a level, but it's murky. 100%. And so really what it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but the value that I can see from this as a business owner is really clarifying all these things that we have up here.
100%.
A lot of stuff exists in our brain, but if you can't communicate that effectively,
you can't execute on it.
Yeah. So this is really all about taking what we already inherently know through experience and actually being able to lay it out in a very clear manner for execution purposes.
Yep, absolutely. And to keep yourself focused on the right things. That's another reason to break out the risks and opportunities, is to prioritize. Which ones are most likely to happen? Which ones are the biggest impact? Which ones should we focus on? You can do a lot of things. Like, what should you do is a totally different conversation than what could we do, right? And so the whole concept of the strategy of everything, and why it's called the strategy of everything, is because it's designed to make everything just like a simple, clear conversation. And so you can look at it and you're like, oh, that's actually pretty basic and straightforward. And you're like, yeah, that's the whole point. That thing's supposed to do one thing and get you clear on that thing. So then you can now talk about it. And then we create a common language. So now we're talking about risks and opportunities, and we're talking about constraints, and you and your team understand, which constraint should we focus on, or which, advantage do we need to take right now, right? So it's all about getting that simplicity.
Sorry, let me jump back in, and I agree. Simplicity is like chef's kiss, right? My dad,
it
is hard.
Really hard. That's the trick of simplicity. It's really
that is a trick. My dad always used to have this saying, the KISS rule: keep it simple, stupid.
Yeah.
And he used to drill that in my head as a kid, and I think he was right. That old dad wisdom. But you just touched on something that I find really interesting, particularly in small business, is using common language. Mm-hmm. So I think in a small business, everyone comes together. And as you bring people into the team at different capacities, you don't know how to speak to each other. But creating that common language and using maybe a framework like this framework, the strategy of everything, you can actually say, I have an idea, and here's how I can frame it in a way that the rest of the team will understand.
And that's like incredibly valuable. And it's important for small business. It's even more important for bigger businesses, because if you think about, you're a team of 3 or 4, or however many people you're working with. Now, what if that was one team, and there's 5 teams, and that's one department, and then there's 10 departments. And so everyone's trying to work together, and everyone talks about a different thing, or says something and means something different to
miscommunication is rife in business.
It's impossible. And so that's where, again, creating that common language to say, and using these kinds of visual, practical tools is really easy. So you can be like, hey, I had this idea last night, and I did a quick risk and opportunity map on it. Here, what do you think? You can just send it to them, and they know what it is. They know what they're reading. They're like, oh, okay, actually, I think that could be up here, and that could be, you can have those conversations a lot more organically and quickly.
This is very interesting. I'm learning so much sitting across from you. Awesome. Thank you. Like I'm
glad
already
you're finding it valuable. Yeah.
Next week, I'm like, oh, we have a team meeting on Monday. I think I know what I'm going to be doing on Monday.
Yeah, awesome.
At least working on the common language piece. I think that is, I think, something that is not intuitive in a business. You're a business owner, you go in, everybody thinks the way that I do.
Right.
So not true.
It's
so
not true. Yeah.
And the rest of this, you have these setting goals and aligning tasks, understanding constraints and rules, assessing risks and opportunities, and then, going through figuring out what your unfair advantage is, and then utilizing this. And then you have this undercurrent of creating common language, of, aligning everybody. So there's a lot more. While it seems like a very simple framework, there's a lot that
the benefits of it are a lot bigger. And I think, like we talked about earlier, it's like making things simple is really hard. And so the more basic and clear, like there's a tool called the Business Model Canvas, and they teach it in a lot of things. So I worked with the guy who created it, Alex Osterwalder, who's like a genius business thinker. And I worked with him at his company Strategizer for 4 years or something. And a lot of what I learned from him is in the tools. And I interviewed him actually just a couple of weeks ago about, his journey and stuff. And that's what I've been working on, the strategy of everything, is like, I'm interviewing people from he's obviously in the business world, but I've been interviewing people from all over, different, Food Network chef and sportscasters, beer makers, like these kinds of, and talking just about what they're doing. And then what I do is have that conversation, because they always say, oh, I don't have a strategy, I just did it. And that, okay, cool. But we'd have that conversation and learn about their journey. And then I use the tools to break down exactly what they did, and then find insights that we can then take back to the business world. And so a lot of those conversations are diving deep into things that you probably haven't thought about that much. For example, is like, have you ever stopped to think about a window washer? And what is the strategy of how they wash a high-rise building? You probably never stopped to think about it. There are people who have dedicated their entire lives to figuring out how to make sure that guy doesn't fall off the building. Right?
It's true, though.
Or a rodeo clown. Like, you've never stopped to think about the strategy of a rodeo clown. But there are people who have dedicated their lives to figuring out how that guy can distract a bull so he doesn't get killed and nobody else does. And there's got to be a strategy to it. And so the tools, and why it's called the strategy of everything, is because you can use them to break down anything. And then you can find some insights that you can apply back to business.
I love that, Dave. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you expanding on each of those points in such detail, and really trying to apply it, and like, how might you execute it. Before we head off here, if anybody wanted to connect with you and find out more about the work that they do, or that you do and your team does, how can they get a hold of you? Yeah, so they can go to thestrategyofeverything.com. All of those tools that I've just talked about, all 4 of them, are all free to download. They're just
like a PDF, kind of walks you through it. And then we're going to be running a boot camp this summer. So a 6-week kind of program to walk, entrepreneurs and marketers to excel, up level these 4 strategic thinking skills. And then just, if they want to do some sessions with their company, and you can find all the info there.
And if someone wants to talk to you directly, where can they find you?
Yeah, that's my email is all on there, and they can just reach out directly. And LinkedIn is the best place as well. That's kind of where I've been putting my time and energy as well.
You have a podcast?
Yeah. So those interviews that I've been doing, I'm compiling these stories to write a book or to make a book about the strategy. So you learn the tools and then hear all these strategies. And I'm very lazy and I don't actually like writing. And so I'm just recording the interviews. And then I was like, I should just put these out as a podcast. So you can find it there too. It's on Spotify. It's also on YouTube. You can go check it out and see some of the old episodes that I've been working on, and they're progressing in the quality. I definitely took let's just start and get out the door mentality with the first few, but they progressively are getting more professional. So
hey, that's the nature of business,
quite
right?
This professional, but
well, hey, if you'd ever like to make them professional,
right? See.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dave. I really appreciate your insight and your breakdown of the strategy of everything. You've obviously done a ton of thinking about it and really how to apply it in a real world sense, not just for marketers, but for business owners and everybody else. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Amazing. Thank you for listening to this episode of Marketing News Canada with our guest, Dave Thompson. For more insightful conversations with Canada's top marketers, visit marketingnewscanada.com. A huge thank you to our producers at Social Next Events and our editors at Social Launch Labs.